Well, hello again, and welcome, as we've been saying, to our 8th series of conversations on the Christian life. And today, we are very, very fortunate to have with us Father Ray Carey, who is, he'll tell you about himself in just a moment, okay? But here he is as we speak, okay?
Michael.
Father, good to see you.
And you as well.
Thank you very much. Should we tell them that we've known each other for a day or two?
Oh, a day or two.
Maybe we'll keep that to ourselves.
60 years, is it?
65 years.
65 years.
Right now. Is that unbelievable?
It is to me.
It seems like it to me. I didn't know we were that old, actually. Let's walk on down.
All right.
We're in Queen of Peace Catholic Church, and we will sit in front of this spectacular icon that we both happen to know the writer of this icon. And we'll kind of just talk about the idea that Jose Pagola talks about in his book, Jesus, an Historical Approximation. And we will talk about one of the chapters that deals with Jesus and his work with the last, or the lowest of the low. That sound good?
Sounds wonderful.
Excellent. Have a seat. So as I was saying, Father, we're going to be dealing with Jose Pagola's book on Jesus. Mm-hmm. As you are familiar with this book, we've used it a lot and talked a lot about it. And today we're going to deal with the chapter in the book that deals with Jesus as defender of the last, or of the lowest. Before we begin, tell us some things about yourself. Who are you?
Priest of the Archdiocese of Portland.
Perfect.
For 52 years.
Really?
Yeah.
Gosh, you must be a really old guy.
I have the scars for that.
I can demonstrate this.
I have a PhD in clinical psychology, and I am a professor at Mount Angel Seminary of pastoral counseling.
Okay.
And happily so.
Yeah. And you've done a great deal of international lecturing as well.
I have, particularly in the world of training vocation ministers for how to do assessments of candidates.
Oh, wow. That must be fascinating.
It is, indeed, especially internationally and cross-culturally.
Sure.
Very interesting business.
Sure. Wow. How in the world did you ever decide on psychology?
I decided on psychology because I was so poorly prepared in the seminary.
Wow.
And what I discovered was I could read the gospel in Greek, but nobody asked me to do that.
Yeah.
But I didn't know how to do anything with counseling of the parishioners.
Sure.
So I went to the bishop and said, I want to study psychology. And so he sent me for the MA and the PhD both.
Wow. Well, this may be a question for another day, but are, in fact, seminary students better trained today to do what you realized you were not trained well enough to do in the old days?
It's the number one reason why I teach that course and have since 1986 in the seminary, is to give them basic skills, to give them a running start in the ministry, to try to help the people where they are. And rather than just listen, care, and have some skills to help them remediate what seems to be difficulties in their lives.
Wow.
So I hope they're better prepared.
If
they're not, it's partly my fault.
We're not going to go there. Well, are other seminaries doing the same kind of thing?
Yes, they are, actually.
That's exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I recollect from my own experience, that was nowhere to be found at that time. Of course, that, once again, as we were saying, that was 60 years ago. So that's exciting to know that things are very different now than they had been.
It's not only was nowhere to be found, psychology was looked upon very skeptically by the powers that be in charge of formation.
Okay.
Because
of
but
that is no longer the case.
No, it doesn't seem to be at all.
Okay.
It's evidence-based, has permeated not only healthcare and insurance for healthcare.
Oh, sure, of course.
But evidence-based in psychology,
that
you can't just claim, well, I find it helpful.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be demonstrably helpful.
This is for real.
Empirically.
Wow, yeah. That's terrific. Well, in the chapter that we were talking about here, one of the reasons that I invited you to be a part of our conversations is because of your background in this. This chapter deals with the lowest of the low, or the last, as Father Pagola puts it. Talk to me a little bit about how he sees the lowest. How does Pagola see that?
You know, Michael, I think that there's one word that St. Luke uses in his gospel for the poor. He uses it in the Magnificat when Mary's praying her prayer of praise to God for bringing down the powerful and lifting up the lowly. And the Greek word that Luke uses is tapianosi.
Okay.
And tapianosi means the dregs of society, the poorest of the poor, those who are without recourse, those who are without means or measure. And Mary considered herself one of the tapianosi, and so did Jesus. Jesus was one of the last. He was one of the least.
Sure.
And he envisioned the kingdom of God as being inclusive and welcoming and invitatory. And he began first with the poor of the poor. But in Galilee at that time, it was very easy to do because almost everybody was poor.
Yeah.
The rich landowners were mostly in Jerusalem or in Sepphoris or Tiberias,
Right, right.
cities built by Herod Antipas.
And they would have been relatively close to where he had grown up in Nazareth. He up the hill.
Very close.
You have to go down into that, but
5 kilometers.
that whole area of the Galilee.
That's right. Approximately 5 kilometers.
Yeah, well, it's like nothing. Well, and also, when you think about, perhaps, and this may be my bias in there as well, when you think about Jesus after 2,000 years, I don't think one of the first thoughts that people have is, oh, what an incredibly low status he would have had as just a person coming out of that territory. Until you hear things like, did anything good ever come out of Nazareth?
That's right.
You know, things like that. That's a pretty poor environment up there. Anything good come out of that? But I think we have to see it that way. I think we have to see that, in fact, that is exactly who he was. And this may have been the impetus for a huge amount of how he approached people.
You know, very much so. If I may, just for a moment, you know,
Absolutely.
like when I was doing my studies in psychology, I became fascinated with anxiety.
Oh.
The origins, the etiology of anxiety. Wasn't interested in having it.
Yeah,
I
we
was
don't want to do
interested
that if we
in
can help it. Yeah.
the interventions for it. And I caught myself thinking and praying about, what would Jesus anxious about? And he was truly a human being.
Sure.
Therefore, he experienced anxiety as all human beings do. And I thought a lot about that. What did Jesus worry about? What gave him anxiety for us, for his disciples?
Yeah.
And I lit on 2 things, and I think only 2 things, that gave Jesus anxiety for us.
What do you think?
Wealth and power. And the gospel is
Okay.
replete with warnings about wealth and power. Not because either is evil in itself, neither is. But both are used as clubs, and always have been and are today, to domineer people, to commandeer people's lives. Wealth and power.
Wealth and power.
And those are the 2 cancers that can undo his vision of the kingdom among his disciples and his followers. And the church has been subject to that over the years as well. Francis, God bless him, has warned the bishops and the cardinals over and over again not to be ambitious, not to be looking ahead, not to be putting their own agenda first. That's part of the wealth and power concern.
Well, I had mentioned to you when we were first talking about this book by Terry Eagleton. And one of his contentions is that Jesus came really for the lowest of the low. That's really the group he came for. And the way Eagleton saw it, or sees it, is that Christianity somewhere along the line was hijacked by the rich and powerful. How does that fit into that kind of a notion?
Well, I think Father Pagola gives us his answer to that, Michael, when he distinguishes the code that had become operative from the fidelity to the Torah, to living as closely as possible the law of God in Leviticus, Deuteronomy, that the holiness code of Judaism was to imitate God's holiness by being faithful to God's law, and as carefully and closely as possible. And that means separating from anything that was impure or anything that tainted that holiness enterprise. And Jesus came along and he did not endorse that.
Yeah, big time.
He rather than functioning from a code of holiness, functioned from a code of compassion and justice. And he believed that if we wanted to embrace God, if we wanted to discover God, we must imitate God's compassion and justice and dignity for the poor. Without the dignity for the poor, we have no compassion.
Well, and at that time, as you were saying, you were ostracized, really, if you fell into categories outside the law.
Right.
Whether you're a woman with your menstrual cycle or just having given birth,
Exactly.
or if you were the lowest of the low, you were held off, you were put away.
That's right.
Jesus wouldn't have any of that.
That's right.
He wouldn't have any of that. Wow.
And in addition to that, not only did he advocate for a code of compassion and justice, imitating God, he also was the friend of sinners. I love it. Every time I think about it before Mass, that the indictment against Jesus was, this man welcomes sinners. Why, he even eats with them.
He eats with them. That was a huge deal.
Huge deal.
Eating with someone because of the various prescriptions of the law.
Correct.
That was absolutely forbidden. That's as far away. And he almost flaunted it, it seems to me, that he had no trouble with that, as though he would bring this to mind for those folks who were being very contentious on the other side.
The catch with Jesus was this. Judaism recognized that people can convert. People can change their lives. People can seek God's forgiveness.
Sure.
What Jesus is uniquely known for is that he was a friend of sinners before conversion.
Oh,
For him.
Yeah, that's huge, isn't it?
Huge. Invitation, welcome, inclusivity took place for Jesus before conversion. And that's extraordinary. It's a real radical reverence of persons.
One of the things that Pagola talks about, and that that I've talked about with other conversation people, is the idea of women as always second-class citizens, if they were citizens at all.
Right.
How does that play out when we talk about things like being pushed off and held off at a distance? Where is that going to break down? We see, for instance, as you're saying, Jesus in inviting, even what might be considered scurrilous women to sit down and eat with him.
They were welcome.
They were welcome. How did that play out eventually in the eyes of those around him?
Oh, it was hugely scandalous. In fact, it was scandalous not just for scurrilous women. He had a number of women that were part of his company.
Yeah.
In the code of Judaism at the time, a woman could not become a disciple of a rabbi, but they did for Jesus.
Yeah.
In fact, there were several women who traveled with the apostles and with Jesus in his company, which was scandalous. A woman couldn't even be outside the home without the permission of the male in her life who had responsibility for her.
Yeah.
And not only that, there were 3 women that Luke names, Susanna, Joanna, who picked up the tab for Jesus and the apostles. They not only accompanied him, they paid their way.
Well, and something I had read, I don't know when, was quite emphatic that with the Last Supper, for instance, somebody had to cook that meal. You can bet it was not one of the guys.
It's not one of the guys. I have no problem imagining that.
Yeah.
In fact, Jesus always had an open table. People were welcome to his table. Why would that not be the case at the Last Supper?
Sure. So he was
just kind of hard to spot them.
Speaking of which, right here behind us, we have Jesus looking over our shoulder. That's kind of nice.
It is nice.
I guess. We'll hope so.
It's a little daunting when you're preaching, though. You know?
I'll bet it is. Yeah, I'll bet if you're working and you're like that, and you've got all the guys stacked up here behind you, that could be a little much. Oh my goodness. Well, the theme of this whole series that we're working at, as I've told you, is the idea of kind of the evolutionary process of morality.
Yeah.
As I talked about in one of the very first of these conversations, we go back 3.5 billion years to the origins of life on this particular rock, after 14 billion years of the whole process in the universe. At some point, everything changed, and as I think we've talked about this before, Richard Leakey and a number of other folks of his ilk put the changing and then the real change in human interactions and whatnot with the advent of language, which is why I've entitled this series in Principio, Erat, Verbum. In the beginning was the word, based on an idea given to me by Elaine Park. That notion of this is how it all started. Well, if that's the case, humanity goes, or Homo sapiens even at some point, goes a long, long way before you get into this notion of speaking and the broadening of communion with the rest of the world. Prior to that, it was a very tribal. Everything was tribal. Still is in a lot of ways.
Still is.
But that allowed a change. Jesus then will come at the end of what I think is an absolutely phenomenal period of time of maybe 3,000 years, out of 3.5 billion, about only 3,000 years, starting off with things like the Upanishads and the Vedas, even the Achaeans and some of the things that came right out of Sargon the Great in that time, down through Hebrew scriptures, down through Confucius and Lao Tse and the Buddha, down through Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, to Jesus. Where along that route would you imagine Jesus could become so radical in his view of the lowness of society and how we have a broader obligation than just to protect our little tribal units and actually work on a much broader scale? What could possibly have done that for a person like him?
I think really getting beyond the letter of the law, the code of holiness, from the law, from the Torah, is that Jesus had a deep identification with and intimacy with his God, his Father. And that happened for him in the desert, from all we can tell.
After the baptism?
Before the baptism.
Okay.
That he was taken with John as a disciple
yes.
of John the Baptizer.
Right.
And in that time in the desert, when Jesus was away from everything, and I think sorting through his life to that point, he really came to a deep awareness of God's graciousness, God's goodness, the radical goodness of God's care for God's creation. And that includes everybody. Yeah. And at the time, like, my God, the history of the Jews, they were oppressed by the Egyptians, by the Assyrians, by the Babylonians, by the Persians, by the Greeks, and then in the time of Jesus by the Romans. Yep. They were so used to being downtrodden and the tapionosi that Jesus, I think, quite naturally came to his awareness of his God's compassion and love for the poor. And that sense of morality is going to begin with the inclusivity and the welcome of everybody to God's gracious love and goodness.
Well, and the Jewish, the tremendous hatreds even for the Jews through history is showing up right now in our own society.
Exactly.
Right now. I know there's a huge concern about that right here within this nation of ours.
Exactly.
That of all things, we're going back to a very anti-Semitic time.
Absolutely.
Why? Why in the world would that be the case?
That's as close to the question of evil as anything.
I think so.
know.
Yes, I think so. And Jesus, well, as Pagola puts it at one time, his argument was not with the Romans. His argument was with evil.
That's right.
That was the key point for him. And God was, as Father Pagola puts it, God was in fact the anti-evil. That's the key, and that was the key behind, for instance, the reign of God, or as Elaine Park likes to put it, the presence of God. That would drive him forward. And tremendous compassion.
And also made him very sensitive to the dangers of wealth and power.
Yeah.
And why he cautioned his own disciples. And Luke is such a great advocate of that.
Well, we don't know a lot about how he came to those individual places. Well, I think that the Pagola puts it in terms of the secret life of Jesus. And Mark's gospel in some ways deals a lot with the secret life of Jesus. We just don't know what happened. There's a 30-year gap in there that something was going on.
We have a good guess, Michael.
Okay.
We have a good guess, and it's purely that. It's not
Sure.
demonstrable from extra biblical sources. But we know that Herod Antipas, the tetrarch of Galilee,
Right, one of those four.
took the city of Sepphoris, which was destroyed by the Romans when Jesus was 6 years old,
Yep.
and rebuilt it magnificently
Yeah.
as his capital,
Yeah.
the capital of Galilee. And not only that, further north, he built the city of Tiberias. Just by accident, it happens to get named
Isn't that
for the
remarkable?
emperor of Rome.
How would that ever have
Isn't
happened?
that
It's
a strange
remarkable. It
happenstance?
is, yeah. Even sometimes the Sea of Galilee is referred to as the Sea of
City
Tiberias.
of Tiberias.
Who was this Tiberias guy?
He was the one that had the checks for Herod Antipas. But the key piece
He
there
was
is
some kind of a crack. Well,
that in order for Herod Antipas to do that, he needed laborers.
sure.
And he drafted and conscripted all kinds of tapionosi
See.
in the Galilee
Yep, yep.
to go and build those cities. Every reason to believe that Jesus and Joseph, who were tektons in the Greek, which gets translated as carpenter, has nothing to do with
No,
what we know as carpenter.
Yeah. It's a builder of some various
Builder
sorts.
with stone and steel or
Yeah.
metals, that as laborers they would have been conscripted probably to do that.
Sure.
That's the best guess of what happened to those 30 years.
Yeah. Well, and his father was a professional, if you call that a professionalism as a builder, and he followed right along with that. What would that kind of laborer bring to the place that he would end up in the things that we're talking about right here?
I think it would only, as his experience of being among the last and the least. You mentioned a professional. Actually, they were artisan
Yes,
class.
they were artisans, yeah.
And the next one below that were the beggars.
Yeah, yeah.
So they were not.
That's true. Professional was not the right word at all. You're right, artisan was it.
That's right.
And they were very accomplished. As
Very
you're saying,
much
they
so.
could do all kinds of different types of building projects.
Absolutely. But they had no status in society.
Yeah. And status was so incredibly important. And it's, well, maybe because he came out of that background, that he was so compassionate toward the lowest of the low and
Absolutely.
the last. He could see them with eyes that no one else could see them with.
And you know, too, Michael, like as we always know and say today, that the key to coming out of poverty and oppression is education. Well, in the Roman Empire, only 3% of those in the provinces were literate.
Yeah.
In Palestine, 3%.
Yeah.
So your best guess is Jesus was illiterate.
Probably, yeah.
He wasn't one of those
Yeah.
of the priestly class.
No.
Or
There
the
was no
scribes.
reason that he would have been literate.
None.
And when he even is in the synagogue and with the scrolls and whatnot, he didn't have to read that. He had learned those pieces.
He would learn it.
And he can say, this, this is taking place within your hearing right now. He knew all that stuff.
He knew all that.
Yeah.
But you know, I see that also as a little peek at how Luke lets his Greek show that
He does, yeah.
from his society,
Sure.
everybody was educated and literate.
Huge portions, yeah.
You know, and he would have assumed that Jesus could read.
Well, probably
Not the case.
You probably not. Well, and I think, you bring up Luke and his writing and his Greek background and whatnot. I think he plays such an important role in that bridge between the Roman-dominated society and the New World, as it were.
The New World.
Which happened to be the Greek world at the time.
That's right. That's right.
Well, and as Pagola mentions too, you and I have talked about this in the past, Jesus did not speak Latin. All he would have run into Latin would have been a few soldiers here and there.
That's correct.
He didn't speak Latin.
It was a language
but
of the court.
He probably did speak Greek, or at least...
he was certainly familiar with it. Because
Greek.
it was a passageway from the east to the Mediterranean.
Yeah. Well, and Capharnaum, for instance, Capernaum, was right on the Via Maris, which is way from the sea, but it's coming down and it'll go across and then down the sea. There would have been a lot of traffic from people who were very likely Greek speakers.
That's right.
And so he would have been familiar with it for just practical purposes as well.
That's right.
But not Latin.
Not Latin.
Isn't that remarkable? All that Latin. So I titled this in Principio Erat Verbum. I should have had that in the Greek.
Jesus would have said, say what?
Say what?
That's
Say
right.
who you. God, that's great. Okay, so let's take a few steps forward about 2,000 years and see how does this, because the contention through these conversations is that Jesus really was a high point in many ways in moral thought and action, not just thought, but action. Now, over these 2,000 years since, he has had many different ramifications in society. How would we today recognize the lowest or the last? Within our society, the lowest in our society would have no reference whatsoever to the lowest in his.
Right.
Or if we even talk about Mother Teresa in Calcutta, that's an entirely different low than we experience here. When I was teaching downtown in Portland, each year the freshmen in the high school would go downtown and work with the chapel downtown. And I was speaking with a gentleman who was a homeless fellow, and we were talking about what do you need? Mm-hmm. And he said, if anybody comes to you and says, I need money for food, he says, don't give them a dime. He says, there is so much food available for the homeless or whatnot in the city. They want it for something else. So don't fall for that. I said, well, that's nice. What do they need? And he said, what they need, what we need, what I need is for something like this. Talk to me.
Recognize me.
Talk to me. Recognize me. Just talk to me. I don't care if you've got money or whatever. Just talk to me. Yeah. And he said so often he'll find that the homeless will find that people will just walk past them. Try to pretend that they're not even there. Just walk right on past them. And he said, just stop and talk. You know, we're all human beings together. How does that fit in with the progression of the morality of taking care of the lowest in our society that purports to be Christian?
Interesting you call it progression. I begin to think it as regressive.
Yeah, I think so. At the present time, I think you're right.
And the division, as it goes deeper and deeper, is always going to have the expendables, and the first ones who are expendable are those who have no means, no power.
Sure.
So we're back to wealth and power once again. And for Jesus, it's about inclusivity, it's about welcoming, it's about dignity, and it's about hope. More than anything else, what Jesus gave the tapianosi of his time was hope. They'd lost all grounds for hope, all reason for hope. They were taxed to the maximum.
Yeah.
They had
nothing in the first place, but they were taxed for whatever they did have left over.
That's right. They had lost all their land. They were reduced to peasantry.
Yeah.
And even then, as a sharecropper, there would be a representative of the Roman government at the threshing floor to take half of their crop right off the top.
And if you had a family, that's starvation.
That's starvation. Not only that, Herod Antipas would tax you, in addition to what the Romans did. And not only that, the temple in Jerusalem taxes you.
Again.
So, I mean, they had no hope. There was no possibility of being extricated from their poverty and their lowliness. And today we have people in a comparable situation. Most of the world is in that circumstance.
Huge percentage of the world.
Huge percentage.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the society in which we live kind of blunts that for us. We don't really recognize that this is a universal fear and abandonment, really,
Yeah.
from those who could help but don't.
Yeah.
What's our obligation?
I think it's right in front of us daily, as opposed to taking on the global universe. It's making sure daily that we're responsive to Jesus' invitation to be inclusive and welcoming and generous, and recognizing that it's not out of charity that we would do that. It's out of justice that we would do that. And you know, the radical meaning of justice in the Hebrew tradition is not the way we think of justice as being equitable or fair, consistent with the law. Do I have redress by the law here? Justice, when they talk about God being just, is God being kind. It's kindness. Abbot Bonaventure at Mount
That's
Angel,
terrific.
God rest him,
Yeah, God bless him.
he loved that part when he translated the Psalms for the Grail.
Yep.
He translated that whenever it said God's justice, he always substituted kindness, God's
Really?
loving kindness.
I hadn't noticed that. I've got to go back and look at the Psalms
Take a
again.
look at. Oh, Bonaventure translated.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah.
right. Oh, that's great.
But I love that. I love that notion.
Yes.
And it's not
Kindness, yeah.
condescending sharing from my wealth.
Yeah.
It's the justice out of God's kindness to the poor.
Well, injustice often has a real edge to it. Okay.
Oh, that's right.
Bang! This is it. Da-da-da-da.
Get off my property.
Absolutely.
That's right.
That doesn't work with kindness.
That's right.
Those two are not really compatible.
You know, in
Oh, my
the 1980s, I was in Chicago doing some training for vocation ministers. And one of the big issues at the time was AIDS.
Sure.
And is it
Sure.
ethical? Is it moral? Is it even legal to be testing future seminarians or candidates for religious life for AIDS?
AIDS.
That was a big moral issue. And we were discussing that, several of the vocation ministers, at a meal in a hotel.
Sure.
And one of the women at the table was a physician who had spent the last 20 years in Chad,
Oh my goodness.
when Chad was poor, before
yeah,
they
yeah.
discovered oil,
Before they got the oil,
which
yeah.
only made the
rich
government
richer.
rich.
Yeah, the richer, yeah, yeah.
Anyway, she wasn't saying anything, and she was the only MD at the table. And I said to her, "Sister, what do you think?" She said, "Oh gosh," she says, "I'm just trying to catch up with the conversation. I haven't been able to figure out what's the problem yet." And I said, "Well, the problem is welcoming somebody who might have AIDS into the community." And she said, "I still don't see the problem." She said, "I just spent 20 years, doing surgery, birthing babies, no gloves, no PPL,
Yeah.
And she said, "I expect to die of AIDS, but I guess I'm wondering what's the issue."
What's the problem there? That's
And
true.
boy, that was just like, what
My
an
goodness.
incredible,
Oh, that's fantastic.
like helping us just almost physically come right back to the heart of the gospel.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
What have you elevated above persons? Convenience, education, property, whatever it may be, doesn't belong there in God's design.
What is God's design?
What is God's design? Jesus tells us
That's it. We have to go to Jesus, I
we have
think.
to go to Jesus, the reign of God, the basileia tou theou, the kingdom of God, as Jesus envisioned it, belongs to the poor.
Belongs, absolutely. That they were the primary subjects. They
Correct.
were it.
That's it. And it was like so amazing, and that's what he gave them, was hope in the Galilee. That here they're crushed from all sides with no hope and no future. And along comes Jesus and he says, "Blessed are you poor." And that's out of a long Jewish tradition that
Yeah, yeah,
if you're rich, God has blessed you.
God,
If
that,
you are
that was
poor-
it. That was the signifier. The signifier.
That's correct.
Is that you were well loved by God.
And if you were sick or poor, you were not. Either you or
Yeah. You did something wrong,
or your ancestor
ancestors
did.
did something wrong. Too bad for you.
And Jesus is saying to them, "Blessed are you poor. The kingdom of God is yours." Blessed are you who weep, you shall laugh. Blessed are you who are hungry now, which was everybody.
Yeah.
You will have your fill. That in God's proper justice, meaning loving kindness, all will be well, beginning with the last and the least. But all are welcome.
Yeah. Well,
what hope that Jesus gave.
Yeah, I'm just thinking the same thing. That's so incredibly uplifting. Who do you see at present time in our society, which is in many ways a very strange society? Who are the low, or who are the last in our society? How would you see that right here and now?
Those that have no future.
Okay.
Those that have no hope. Those who don't even dare to dream, or to think how it could be better. Could it ever be better? Those who are abandoned. Those who are alienated. And it begins also with, my God, we have thousands every day at our borders.
Yeah. Yes.
That's the tapionosi of our time.
Which many of us would want to just keep out of here.
Correct.
Go, get out.
Correct.
We don't want to talk to you. We don't want to talk about
Correct.
this. What is our obligation? What is our obligation in the eyes of Jesus?
I think that's the question every Christian has to ask in his or her heart.
Well, I hate to be mean or whatever about this, but is Christianity, in many of its unravelings over these years, in our society, is Christianity really the way Jesus envisioned his mission?
I'm not a cultural anthropologist.
Sure.
But Michael, my sense of that is that as we see the research from the Pew Research every year tells us, we are becoming increasingly unchurched. That people are identifying less and less with Christianity or any other religion.
Yes.
But among the poor, the gospel's always done well.
Isn't that's true? That's remarkable.
And I think the reason
when we look at the world society today, that's exactly the case.
All the beautiful gospel, from the African American community.
Exactly.
My God, those are songs of hope, and because they get it, that God loves them and cares about them.
That's terrific. Well, and when you look back at the American experience of slavery, very often out of the slave situations came exactly what you're talking about, music and whatnot that reflects the notion of hope.
That's right.
It was all they had.
And it wasn't just cognitive, it was at an affective level.
Yeah.
You get into those hymns, and they really grip your heart, they grip your life,
So then you would see the poor, and that almost has to go into quotes, I think, the poor in our society as those who are hopeless or who cannot see a way forward.
That's right.
You think so?
I do, and I also think those who are physically poor as well, who have no access to anything, hygiene, nutrition, medical care, dental care, those kinds of things.
Wow. What's our obligation?
What's our obligation?
I keep coming back to that, but what's our obligation?
Exactly the same as it was that Jesus gave his disciples. How do we go about that? That's the key question. Is it a change of structure?
Yeah.
It was interesting at the time of, you mentioned earlier, St. Teresa of Calcutta, that among religious communities, she was often looked upon kind of like with a tolerance or a bit of disdain because they didn't see her changing structures. They saw her doing direct service to the poor, and that their belief was, you want to really help the poor, you got to change the structures. And her response to that was, give me your babies, give me those babies give them to me.
Bring them over here.
Bring them here. Like, you can work on structures, you do whatever you want.
Yeah.
I'm going to take care of these babies right here.
Well,
I guess it takes both.
I think you're right. I was just going to say one of her other things was, I can make a huge difference, one person at a time.
Yeah.
I can't deal with society as such, but I can make a big difference one person at a time.
One person at a time.
Maybe that's what we're already called to one person at a time. Who might that person be within our own experience?
Mm-hmm.
But that idea, that one person at a time. Wow. Well, and we know that our present political environment in this country and in many parts of the world is very fractious. People trying to understand, trying to come to a notion of how do I really act here? And then many would seem acting out of fear, great fear that. But if I make that change, what happens? And what happens to the person I think I am or have been brought to believe I am? How do I make that change?
And how does my security change?
Exactly.
When I make that change.
Absolutely.
Right.
What would Jesus say to that?
Do it.
Do it. I think so.
Nike's right. Just
do it. Just go out there and do it.
You know, I had an interesting experience
Whoa.
teaching at Mount Angel. This happened a couple of years ago. I teach deacons before they're ordained in the priesthood. And I was teaching ethics, ministerial ethics.
Sure.
And I said something about professional ethics. You know, it has to guide your practice as a priest. And one of the deacons raised his hand and he said, I'm offended by that. He said, I'm not a professional, I have a vocation. And I said to him, isn't that interesting?
How interesting is that?
And I said, you may be interested to know where the word professional comes from. In the Middle Ages, there were only 4 professions: medicine, law, education, and pastoring. And all of those were done by the religious who had made the vows of their lives to God. Professio, I profess my vows to God. So those, quotes, professions were given the name of the ones who did it, who happened to be the religious. By the way, that's you.
Yeah, not by the way, that's you. Yeah, exactly. I think I'd mentioned to you earlier, this was a number of years ago, I was talking to a seminary student. I met him somewhere, I don't even know what. And we were talking, and I said, how did you happen to want to go into the seminary to be a priest? And he said, well, it seemed at the time that was a good career decision. I thought, career decision? It would never have occurred to me to see it as a career decision. Really? It's all about the notion of being called to do a specific thing. Vocation, vocare, to call. Career decision?
Good benefits, retirement benefits.
There you go.
Ultimate benefits.
Well, that's true. There is that. I found that kind of offensive, actually, at the time. I thought, what are you talking about? You missed the whole point of this. It sounds like the person that you're talking about.
Yeah.
My goodness. Well, I can do this. I know I can talk. I'm just constantly amazed, I guess, at, as we first began this conversation, at these thousands of years that drag right down to where we are right now. The many different views, the many different aspects of what it means to be a moral person and to watch out for those who cannot watch out for themselves.
Yes.
And yet, in light of all of that, also, there are times that, when you say hope, that it seems kind of hopeless to me. And I'm not sure that that's possible, and especially in a contentious time that we're in right now. But that is exactly juxtaposed to what Jesus said.
It is.
It was always possible for him.
You cannot give up hope. You cannot and be a follower of Jesus Christ. The kingdom of God is predicated on hope.
Wow, that's grand too. Whew. Well, I'm certainly happy we had this conversation.
I am as well, Michael. And in a way, we've had this conversation for 65 years, did you say?
Yeah, we really have. We've been blessed in that, to have been able to share it over this pretty good amount of time.
Absolutely. And I liked too that when we were younger, that the model we had as the Bishop of Rome was John the 23rd.
That's right. Yes, that's right.
And when he died, after a long career of loving service to God's people, those who inherited from him inherited about $10 each. And now, as we are a little longer in the sunset, that we have Francis as our model.
Yeah.
And his images of the church as a field hospital,
Yes.
going right to those most in need,
Yeah.
is as uplifting for me as John the 23rd was in the
I
beginning.
think you're right. Those two, as kind of bookends to our times, I think, as you're saying, they're spectacular people.
Incredible. Really
spectacular
incredible.
people. Oh. Well, I can't thank you enough for doing this.
Great pleasure.
Anything else you want to throw in before we pack it up?
Go Bears.
Go. Oh no! I'm going to have to explain
Have to
that.
edit
now. Well, thank you so much for being with us.
And you as well,
This
Michael.
is a great treat, Ray.
Great honor. Thank you.
And thank you for being with us as well. This has been an absolute delight. It's a special place for me in having the chance to talk with Father Carey. As always, blessings always.